On this episode of Black Girl Gone, I tell the story of 29-year-old Patrice Wilson from Detroit, Michigan, who disappeared on May 13th, 2023. Patrice was a nurse and a mother who had just finished an overnight shift at a Detroit hospital when she disappeared. Security cameras would later capture a man approaching her car in the parking lot, a man wearing a disguise. Moments later, Patrice was kidnapped. By the next day, she would be found dead. What happened to Patrice wasn't random. It was personal. And when her killer is identified, the family of another woman who disappeared over a decade before began to wonder if the person responsible for her disappearance was closer than they thought. This is Patrice's story. It was just after sunrise in Detroit. Inside Detroit Medical Center, the night shift was ending. Nurses were heading home. Patients were waking up. Life was moving forward, quietly, routinely, the way it always does after a long night shift. Patrice Wilson had just finished her shift at the hospital. She was tired, ready to go home, ready to see her son. But as Patrice walked through the parking structure toward her car, someone was waiting for her, stalking her. Before she could react, the man approached her vehicle. He was wearing a blonde wig, trying to hide who he was. In just moments, Patrice would be forced into her own car at gunpoint. And by the next day, she would be found dead in the trunk. But before Patrice became the focus of an investigation, before her name appeared in local headlines, she was a 29-year-old woman building a life. Patrice was a registered nurse in Detroit. She worked at Detroit Medical Center, where she spent her nights working shifts, caring for patients, people who were sick, injured, or frightened, often at their most vulnerable. Nursing isn't just a job. It's long hours, constant pressure, and emotional labor that doesn't always end when the shift does. And Patrice took that responsibility seriously. She showed up. She worked overnight shifts. She did the kind of work that requires patience, strength, and compassion, especially in a city where hospitals are often stretched thin. But outside of her work as a nurse, Patrice was a mother first. She was raising her son while juggling the demands of a job that rarely left room for rest. Those closest to her described her as devoted, someone who prioritized her family and worked hard to create stability for her child. In her late 20s, Patrice was doing what so many people are still figuring out, managing a career, parenting, and a personal life that didn't always unfold the way she hoped. At one point, Patrice was in a relationship with a man named Jameer Miller. The relationship didn't last, and by 2023, the two were no longer together. And while the details of their time as a couple were never made public, what is known is that Patrice had moved on. She was focused on her responsibilities and the life that she was building for herself and for her child. But ending a relationship doesn't always come with a clear break. Even when something is over, it can linger emotionally, psychologically, sometimes logistically. But from the outside, Patrice appeared to be doing what so many people do after a breakup, continuing forward. By May 2023, Patrice was moving through her life the way she always had. She was working, caring for her son, and managing the things in front of her. Nothing publicly suggested that anything was out of the ordinary. There was no clear rupture in her routine, no moment that stood out at that time. And the morning of May 13th began like so many others, familiar and unremarkable. And then everything changed. In the early morning hours of May 13th, 2023, Patrice finished her overnight shift at Detroit Medical Center. The hospital was transitioning the way it always does at the end of a night shift. Day staff were beginning to arrive. The building was active but subdued. And when Patrice clocked out, she gathered her belongings and made her way out of the hospital and into the parking structure. This was part of her routine. She had parked there before. She had walked this path before. There was nothing about that moment that would have stood out as unusual. No sense that she was being watched. No indication that she was in danger. but security cameras told a different story. Video footage from inside the parking structure would later become a critical part of the investigation. That footage showed Patrice walking to her vehicle shortly before 8 a.m., and it showed someone else nearby, a man. He wasn't walking with purpose toward an exit. He wasn't heading to a car of his own. Instead, he appeared to be lingering, waiting. And what stood out immediately was his appearance. The man was wearing a disguise in an attempt to obscure his identity as he moved throughout the parking lot. And while she walked to her car, Patrice was talking on the phone with a friend, unaware of the danger lurking behind her. As Patrice reached her vehicle, the man approached, and what happened next unfolded quickly. According to investigators, the man confronted Patrice near her car and produced a gun. And at that moment, Patrice was forced into her own SUV. The person on the phone with her heard the encounter. They said they heard Patrice scream, and then the phone went dead. Within minutes, Patrice was inside the vehicle, and the man was driving away. The entire encounter lasted only a few short minutes. And after Patrice's car left that parking lot that morning, she was never seen again. Something was wrong. The person that she had been talking to called her mother, Rosalind, to let her know what happened. Quote, "I got a call from someone who said that they were talking to Patrice on the phone and they heard her screaming," she told a local ABC station. When her family was unable to reach her, police were notified, and investigators began retracing Patrice's final known steps, starting with the place that she had been last seen, Detroit Medical Center. From there, detectives moved methodically, reviewing surveillance footage, speaking with coworkers, and reconstructing the end of her shift. And that's when the video from the hospital parking structure came into focus. The security cameras had captured Patrice walking to her vehicle. And what stood out wasn't just her presence, it was that she wasn't alone. Investigators noticed the man in the footage right away. And as detectives reviewed the video frame by frame, it became clear that Patrice hadn't simply walked to her car and driven away on her own. The footage showed an interaction. It showed Patrice being kidnapped, and then it showed her vehicle leaving the parking lot with her inside. From that moment on, the case shifted. This was not a missing person investigation. It was an abduction. And with that determination, investigators expanded their focus. They worked quickly to identify the man in the footage and to determine where Patrice's vehicle had gone after leaving the hospital. Using license plate information and vehicle tracking methods, police began searching for Patrice's SUV in and around the Detroit area. At the same time, detectives started looking closely at Patrice's personal life. Not because of anything that she had done, but because in cases involving abductions, the answers often lie close to home. They spoke with family members. They asked about relationships. They asked about anyone who might have had a reason to follow Patrice, to know her schedule, to anticipate where she'd be. And as leads came in, one name began to stand out. The man that Patrice had previously been in a relationship with, Jameer Miller. Now, they had been together for almost 3 years before they broke up, and so investigators knew that he was familiar with Patrice's routine, including where she worked and the hours that she kept. They learned that the relationship between the two had ended and that it had been Patrice who ended it. At this early stage, detectives were careful, but they were moving fast. Time was working against them. They gathered information, they verified timelines, and they continued tracking Patrice's vehicle because, more than anything, they needed to find her. As investigators continued digging into Patrice's abduction, the focus naturally narrowed to the people already connected to her life. And as detectives began looking deeper, they realized that Jameer's name wasn't new to law enforcement, and it wasn't new to unsolved tragedies. Because more than a decade earlier, Jameer had been connected to another missing woman. Her name was Bianca Green. Bianca disappeared in 2011 from Romulus, Michigan, about 24 miles west of Detroit. She was a young mother, and when she vanished, she left behind a child she shared with Jameer. At the time, Bianca's disappearance never received the attention it deserved. There was no national outcry, no sustained pressure to find answers. Her case quietly faded from public view, even as the questions remained. Now, years later, as investigators worked to understand what happened to Patrice, that earlier disappearance took on new significance. Two women, more than a decade apart, connected by the same man. In May 2023, 29-year-old Patrice Wilson was kidnapped after leaving her job as a nurse at a hospital in Detroit. As investigators tried to locate her, they began focusing on her ex-boyfriend. And it wasn't the first time a woman in his life had vanished. As investigators continued piecing together what happened to Patrice, they began looking beyond the immediate events of that morning. They asked deeper questions, not just about where Patrice had gone, but about the people connected to her life and whether there were patterns that had been missed before. And that's when another name resurfaced, a name familiar to listeners of Black Girl Gone. In 2023, we told the story of Bianca Green, a young mother who disappeared in 2011, leaving behind a child and a family still searching for answers more than a decade later. As detectives examined Jameer's history more closely, the connection between these two women became impossible to ignore. Patrice Wilson and Bianca Green were separated by more than a decade, but their stories intersected in a way that demanded a closer look. And to understand why Bianca's disappearance suddenly mattered again in 2023, we have to go back to 2011, back to Bianca Green. Years before Patrice disappeared, Jameer had been in another serious relationship, and that relationship was with Bianca. They shared a child together, a little boy named Jameer Jr., and those close to Bianca described the relationship between the two as complicated and on again, off again. She was young, and by all accounts, she was very committed to being a good mother. She worked early mornings at a sandwich shop at the airport and then attended classes at Wayne County Community College several nights a week. She had dreams of becoming a nurse. In 2011, Bianca learned that she was pregnant again with Jameer's child. And according to her mother, Lisa, Bianca was overwhelmed. She was trying to manage the weight of responsibility, the demands of her schoolwork, and the pressure of building a future for her son. Lisa later said that Bianca would sometimes leave her child with his father when she needed a break, but she always came back. And that's what made her disappearance so difficult to understand. Bianca vanished in 2011, leaving behind her son and her family and countless questions. And there's no clear timeline for her disappearance. Some reports suggest that Bianca was last seen at work. Others place her at her apartment. But what is known is that her mother last saw her when Bianca stopped by her job, wearing her uniform, something she did regularly. But later that evening, Bianca's mother began receiving troubling messages from her daughter's phone. The messages talked about wanting to leave and start over, about going to Ohio, about beginning a new life. And then the communication stopped. Bianca's phone went silent, and her calls began going straight to voicemail. Police initially believed that Bianca had left voluntarily. The messages suggested that she wasn't in immediate danger, but there were details that didn't align with that theory. Bianca's car was still at her apartment. Most of her belongings were left behind, and there was no activity on her bank account or credit cards. If Bianca had left to start over, how was she surviving without money? Investigators questioned Jameer Miller, but they said that they had no evidence connecting him to Bianca's disappearance. Her family had concerns, but without proof, their focus remained on finding her. For months, Bianca's mother continued paying her daughter's cell phone bill, hoping that she might answer. she never did. As time passed, reported sightings dried up, and police suggested that Bianca may have been suicidal, but her family disagreed. They knew that Bianca was struggling, but they could not accept that she would leave her son, especially while pregnant. But more than a year after Bianca's disappearance, her family held a press conference, pleading for answers. Bianca's mother, her son, and Jameer stood together, asking for the public's help. Bianca has never been found, and more than a decade later, her disappearance remains unsolved. But when Patrice is kidnapped in 2023, Bianca's family will soon begin to wonder if the person responsible for her disappearance had been right there the whole time. As investigators continued to work to understand what happened to Patrice, within hours, they began focusing on the evidence directly in front of them. They had spoken with Patrice's family, who shared important context about her life in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. According to those close to her, Patrice had been trying to distance herself from Jameer Miller, as she wanted out of the relationship, but they said that Jameer would not let her go. He'd become obsessed, sending her gifts and flowers that she would reject, hoping that he would get the hint. For Patrice, the relationship was clearly over, but Jameer was not willing to accept that. And as detectives continued their work, they also began learning more about Jameer's past, and they discovered he had an extensive criminal record, one that included prior incidents of domestic violence. That information added urgency to the investigation and raised serious concerns about Patrice's safety in the days before she disappeared. At the same time, investigators were closely analyzing the surveillance footage from Detroit Medical Center. Frame by frame, they tracked the movements of the man seen inside the parking lot. His behavior stood out, lingering, waiting, moving with intention, and the disguise he wore immediately drew attention. After studying the footage, police were able to identify the man. It was Jameer. The size, the build, the walk, it was unmistakable. And investigators later confirmed that Jameer had been wearing a long wig in an apparent attempt to hide his identity as he waited inside the parking lot. With that identification, the picture became clear. This wasn't a random encounter. The person who approached Patrice that morning knew her. He did know her routine, and he had taken steps to try to avoid being recognized. From there, the investigation moved quickly, and Jameer was their prime suspect. Detectives were narrowing in on him, but they also had a more important task at hand: finding Patrice. Her family was still holding on to hope that she might be found alive. As the search continued, police expanded beyond Detroit, and then the case took a devastating turn. On May 14th, 2023, the day after Patrice vanished, her SUV was located at an apartment complex in Novi, Michigan. When officers approached the vehicle, what they found confirmed the worst fears of everyone who knew and loved her. Patrice was inside of the back of the truck. She had been shot multiple times. The discovery transformed the investigation completely. What had begun as a kidnapping had quickly become a homicide investigation. And with the discovery of Patrice's body, pressure mounted quickly. Evidence from the surveillance footage, the location of the vehicle, and the connections investigators had uncovered all pointed in the same direction. And not long after Patrice's body was found, Jameer Miller was officially named a suspect, and his picture was shared with the media. With his face plastered all over the news and the police closing in on him, Jameer turned himself in to authorities. He was taken into custody and charged in connection with Patrice's murder. As news of Patrice's murder spread, it didn't just devastate her family, it also reopened old wounds for Bianca's family, who had been living with unanswered questions for more than a decade. After Jameer Miller was arrested in connection with Patrice's killing, Bianca's family began to look at her disappearance through a different lens. For years, they had lived with uncertainty and suspicion. Bianca had vanished in 2011, and despite their doubts, police had maintained that there was no evidence of foul play. Jameer had been questioned back then, but nothing ever came of it. But now, with him charged in the murder of Patrice, Bianca's family couldn't help but wonder if the answers that they had been searching for had been hiding in plain sight. They began asking questions that they hadn't asked before, but this time, those questions carried new weight. If Jameer was capable of planning and carrying out the abduction and murder of Patrice, what did that mean for Bianca? Had her disappearance been mishandled from the beginning? And had the warning signs been missed? For Bianca's loved ones, Jameer's arrest didn't bring clarity. It brought a painful realization that Bianca's case might not have ever been taken seriously enough when it mattered most. And while Patrice's case was moving swiftly through the justice system, Bianca's family was once again left waiting, still searching for answers and still hoping that one day they might finally learn what happened to her. Now, once Jameer was in custody, prosecutors began building a timeline of what they believe had happened in the early morning hours of May 13th, 2023. It was a targeted attack carried out by Jameer Miller, who knew Patrice's routine and knew where to find her. Someone who had become obsessed with her, someone who refused to let her go. He stalked her, abducted her, and then he murdered her. But rather than take the case to trial, perhaps realizing that the evidence against him was overwhelming and knowing he was guilty of this heinous crime, Jameer Miller made a decision. He took a plea deal. In November 2023, after initially facing multiple charges, including first-degree murder, Jameer Miller pled guilty to second-degree murder. The plea meant that there would be no jury, no witnesses taking the stand, and no public trial laying out every detail of Patrice's final moments. For her family, it spared them from reliving the trauma in a courtroom, but it also meant that there were questions that might not ever fully be answered. The court accepted the plea, and with it, the case moved into its final phase, sentencing. And for the prosecution, the guilty plea brought accountability. For Patrice's family and loved ones, it brought a complicated mix of emotions: relief that the person responsible had been held accountable, and heartbreak that Patrice was still gone. But for Bianca Green's family, the plea carried a different kind of weight, because while one case had reached a conclusion, the other remained unsolved. Jameer Miller would be sentenced for the murder of Patrice Wilson, but Bianca Green was still missing, and her family was still waiting for answers. During the sentencing hearing, Jameer admitted responsibility for Patrice's death. Quote, "It ain't nothing I can do to take it back. None of it. It shouldn't have even happened," he said. And then, in a statement that he wrote that was read aloud in the courtroom by his lawyer, he wrote about how often he thinks about the morning he killed Patrice and how she tried to tell him how to stop her bleeding. Quote, "This has been the worst, most haunting experience of my life. Patrice didn't deserve this. We don't deserve to lose both our lives over this. I failed her. I failed us. I am so ashamed," Jameer wrote. Jameer Miller was sentenced to 35 to 60 years in prison. And in the months following her murder, Patrice's family took another step, one that wasn't about the criminal punishment, but about accountability. They filed a civil lawsuit against Detroit Medical Center. The lawsuit alleges that the hospital failed to provide adequate security for its employees, particularly those working overnight shifts. According to the family, surveillance footage showed Jameer Miller inside the parking structure before the kidnapping took place, footage that would later become critical evidence in the criminal case. Patrice's family believes that warning signs were missed. A hospital parking lot is a place where workers should be able to move safely, especially in the early morning hours when staff are coming and going after overnight shifts. And for Patrice's loved ones, the fact that someone was able to wait inside that space, disguise himself, and approach her without intervention raised serious questions. The lawsuit argues that Patrice should not have been left vulnerable in a place connected to her workplace, a place where security measures are expected, not optional. Now, Detroit Medical Center has denied wrongdoing. The hospital has stated that it followed existing protocols, and they expressed sympathy for Patrice's family while disputing the claims of negligence. But for her family, the lawsuit isn't just about money, it's about change. They've said that they want safer working conditions for nurses and hospital staff, especially women who work overnight and are often alone as they walk to their cars. They want to make sure that no other family has to experience the same kind of loss. And the civil case also highlights a broader issue, one that goes beyond Patrice's story. Healthcare workers across the country have long raised concerns about safety, understaffing, and security, particularly during overnight hours. Patrice's death forced those concerns into the spotlight. And while the criminal case against Jameer Miller brought a sentence, the civil lawsuit asks a different question. What responsibility do institutions have to protect the people who show up every day to care for others? For Patrice's family, that question still matters. But as of the recording of this episode, there has been no new public information about the status of this case. Patrice Wilson was 29 years old. She was a nurse, a mother, and a woman who was trying to move forward with her life. She went to work, she finished her shift, and she never made it home. What happened to Patrice is devastating on its own, but when her story is placed alongside Bianca's story, another young mother connected to the same man, another woman whose life was interrupted and whose family was left with unanswered questions, the weight of it becomes even heavier. Two women, years apart, both trying to build a future, both connected to someone who would ultimately be at the center of one tragedy and possibly the other. For Patrice's family, there was at least a measure of accountability, a guilty plea, a sentence, a public acknowledgement that what happened to her mattered. But for Bianca's family, there was still only uncertainty. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths, that leaving a relationship can be the most dangerous moment for a woman, that warnings are often ignored until it's too late, that systems meant to protect, whether they're institutions or investigations, don't always do enough, and that when women disappear or are killed, people who love them are left to carry the burden long after the headlines fade. Patrice Wilson deserved to come home. Bianca Green deserved to be found. And telling their stories is one way to make sure they are not forgotten. If you have any information about the disappearance of Bianca Green, please contact the Romulus, Michigan Police Department. And may Patrice Wilson rest in peace. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Threads.